Picture this. It's the peak of the Maltese summer, 1565. You're crouched behind a shattered limestone wall inside a fort that's already falling apart. Dust is everywhere. The air tastes like salt and smoke. And then you hear it shouting, not just shouting, war cries. Charging straight at you is a wave of the most feared soldiers on earth, the Ottoman Janissaries, silk robes snapping in the wind, polished steel catching the sunlight, faces hardened from decades of conquest. The kind of men Europe has been terrified of for 100 years. They expect you to meet them with a sword. They expect the classic clash of steel and blood. But you don't reach for your blade. Instead, you grab something that looks ridiculous. A simple wooden hoop, wrapped in wool, like something a child would play with. Except it's soaked in a volatile mixture of brandy, oil, saltpeter, and varnish. You strike flame to it, and instantly it erupts into a roaring halo, blue and orange fire twisting like a living thing. Then you throw it. It sails perfectly through the air and lands right over the shoulders of the leading Janissary. The hoop drops over him like a collar, his arms pinned to his sides. His robes ignite instantly, but that's only the beginning. As he screams and thrashes, the hoop tightens. Sticky chemical fire seeps into the joints of his armor. This isn't just burning, this is cooking. His metal suit becomes an oven, like a lobster boiling inside its shell. He staggers backward, straight into his own ranks, a human torch, setting his comrades on fire. And just like that, panic spreads faster than the flames. This wasn't magic. This was chemistry weaponized by desperation. This was the trishaw, a nightmare invention that helped level the playing field between 8,000 defenders and 40,000 invaders. Welcome to the brutal reality of the Great Siege of Malta. Before we unpack the tactical genius and sheer madness of this 4-month slaughter, if you love history that feels less like a lecture and more like a thriller, hit that like button, subscribe, and join us for more stories that sound too insane to be true, but absolutely are. And I want to know, if you had to defend a fortress against impossible odds, which historical commander would you want leading you? Drop your answer in the comments. Because what you just imagined, men screaming in flames on the walls of Fort St. Elmo, wasn't an isolated moment. It was the daily reality of a nightmare that would decide the future of the Western world. To understand why this tiny, sun-baked island became the focal point of a global superpower struggle, we need to start with the man who ordered the invasion, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. By 1565, Suleiman wasn't just a ruler. He was the undisputed master of the geopolitical chessboard. His Ottoman Empire was a marvel of wealth, administration, and military power. His armies had conquered from Baghdad to Budapest. His fleet ruled the Mediterranean like it was their private lake. But despite all that, he had an obsession. A sliver of rock in the middle of the sea, which he called a nest of scorpions. That rock was Malta, and the scorpions living there were the Knights of St. John. These knights were a surviving relic of the Crusades, warrior monks who had been waging holy war for centuries, elite, arrogant, and incredibly dangerous. Because they weren't just knights, they were state-sponsored pirates. They raided Ottoman shipping lanes, hijacked treasure ships, disrupted grain supplies, and humiliated Ottoman merchants. Every raid was more than theft. It was a symbolic slap in the face. For Suleiman, it wasn't just annoying, it was personal. And at 70 years old, looking to crown his reign with one final glorious triumph, he decided Malta would be crushed. So he assembled an armada that terrified every observer who saw it. Eyewitnesses described it like a moving forest of sails, nearly 200 warships, 40,000 troops, among them Sipahis, the feared cavalry, and the Janissaries, the Sultan's personal death squad. Their mission was brutally simple: exterminate the knights, take Malta, and use it as a stepping stone toward Sicily and eventually Rome. If Malta fell, Europe's soft underbelly would be ripped open. Standing in their way was one man, Grandmaster Jean de Valette. He was 71 years old, a scarred veteran of earlier wars, a man of iron discipline and zero compromise. He knew the Ottomans were coming, and he knew help from Europe might not arrive in time, if it arrived at all. His forces numbered around 8,000. Most were Maltese militia, farmers and fishermen with almost no battle experience. Only about 500 were true knights. The math was absurd, 5 to 1. And if you counted trained soldiers, it was closer to 10 to 1. But Valette had two advantages the Ottomans didn't. First, Malta itself, a landscape of jagged rock, brutal heat, and punishing terrain, where the environment could kill as effectively as steel. Second, resolve, the kind of resolve that turns men into weapons. Before the first Ottoman sail appeared, Valette told his defenders, "Here we die for the faith." Not a speech, a statement of fact. And when the Ottoman fleet arrived in May 1565, its commanders, Mustafa Pasha and Piali Pasha, made a fatal mistake. They let ego drive strategy. Instead of striking directly at the main strongholds, they became obsessed with a small, isolated fort guarding the harbor entrance, Fort St. Elmo. It was tiny, star-shaped, barely big enough for a few hundred men. Ottoman engineers looked at it and laughed. They said it would fall in 3 days. Then the cannons began to fire. Basilisks, monstrous guns hurling 160-pound stone balls, pounded the fort into dust. Day 1 passed, then day 2, then day 3. The walls crumbled. Dust choked the defenders. The fort should have been dead. But when the smoke cleared, the flag of the Knights of St. John was still flying. 3 days became a week became 2. The Ottomans were baffled. How were these men still alive? Because inside Fort St. Elmo, the defenders weren't fighting for victory. They were fighting for time, and every day they survived was a day the Ottoman Empire bled. Fort St. Elmo wasn't supposed to last. It wasn't built to withstand a full-scale siege. It was a small outpost, a locked door meant to slow an enemy down for a moment, not hold them back for a month. But those few hundred defenders inside it understood something the Ottoman commanders didn't. They weren't there to survive. They were there to bleed the invaders dry. Evacuation wasn't coming. Reinforcements weren't coming. Letters from Valette made it brutally clear. St. Elmo would be sacrificed for the rest of the island. So the men inside the fort did what doomed men do. They turned rubble into a kill zone. They fought with pikes, with stones, with their bare hands, and with those horrifying incendiary hoops, the trishaw, flinging chemical fire into the massed Janissaries like something ripped from hell. They fought in the breaches, shoulder to shoulder, breathing dust, choking on smoke, slipping on blood. Medieval warfare at its most claustrophobic and horrific. And the reason the Ottomans were trapped in this meat grinder came down to something stupidly human: ego. When Mustafa Pasha and Piali Pasha arrived, they were already at each other's throats. Mustafa, the army general, wanted to land in the north and march inland toward Medina, the old medieval capital. Piali, the admiral, didn't care about Medina. He cared about his fleet. He demanded the harbor be secured first. so they compromised. And in war, a compromise can be a death sentence. They chose to attack Fort St. Elmo. On paper, it looked easy. A tiny star-shaped fort, a few hundred defenders. No hope of relief. Ottoman engineers mocked it. They called it a weak lung that could collapse with a single breath. They were wrong, because they didn't understand the geometry of modern fortifications. This is where the star fort design becomes a weapon. Unlike a square castle with blind corners, a star fort has angled walls designed to cover each other. Every approach is watched. Every assault is punished from multiple directions. There are no dead zones. If you climb one wall, you're being shot in the back from another. So the Ottomans dragged their artillery up the jagged slopes of Mount Sipahis, looming over St. Elmo, and unleashed hell. These weren't normal cannons. They were bronze monsters, basilisks. Stone ball after stone ball smashed into the fort with such force that people heard the bombardment in Sicily, over 60 miles away. Inside St. Elmo, the defenders lived in a nightmare of concussion and flying shards. The world was just dust and screaming and collapsing rock. But even the stone itself fought back. Malta is made of soft limestone, and unlike granite, it absorbs impact rather than shattering. The walls didn't break cleanly. They compacted. They soaked up punishment like a sponge, giving the defenders just enough time to rebuild, reinforce, and endure. Days became weeks. The Ottomans grew furious. The bodies in the ditch outside the fort began piling so high that they formed a ramp. And then, things got worse. A ship arrived from Tripoli. Stepping onto Maltese soil was an 80-year-old man with more respect than the Sultan's own generals. Dragut Reis, the drawn sword of Islam, the most feared corsair in the Mediterranean, a naval genius, a man who had spent his entire life raiding Christian coasts and making empires tremble. When Dragut saw what Mustafa and Piali had done, wasting time on St. Elmo instead of the main city, he was furious. He knew they'd burned precious ammunition and lost time for nothing, but he was a pragmatist. The mistake had been made. Now he had to fix it. Dragut took command of the siege batteries, rearranged the cannons, advanced the trenches, tightened the noose, and under Dragut's eye, the siege became surgical. He didn't just target walls, he targeted mines. He placed snipers to watch the ramparts day and night. If a knight lifted his visor to wipe sweat from his face, a bullet found him. Inside the fort, the conditions turned apocalyptic. The heat was unbearable. Men fought in full plate armor under the Mediterranean sun, dehydrated, deaf, starving, delirious. The wounded lay in agony. The chapel became a charnel house. And yet, every night, under cover of darkness, small boats slipped across the harbor from Birgu. Fresh supplies, a handful of reinforcements. Jean de Valette was feeding men into the furnace. He knew St. Elmo was doomed. He knew every man he sent there was a sacrifice. But every extra day the fort held meant more time for Europe to send help, and more time for the Ottomans to waste supplies. The defenders of St. Elmo weren't fighting for victory. They were fighting for time. They were human currency, spent to buy survival for everyone else. By mid-June, Fort St. Elmo wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a grave with no roof. The walls had been pulverized into dust. The moat was filled with bodies and debris. The surviving defenders were living on adrenaline and prayer. They were deaf from constant cannon fire, covered in sores, starving, and still, they refused to die. The Ottomans couldn't understand it. They had fired 18,000 cannonballs into this tiny ruin. By every rule of war, The garrison should have surrendered weeks ago. But then the Ottomans suffered a blow that crippled their leadership, not from steel, but from fate. On June 18th, Dragut Reyes was inspecting a trench, pointing out a new cannon position. A cannonball struck nearby rock, not him directly, but the impact shattered the stone. A shard, like shrapnel, sliced into Dragut's head. The drawn sword of Islam fell into a coma. He lingered for days. But the brain behind the Ottoman siege was effectively gone. Command fell back to Mustafa Pasha, the man whose brute force tactics had failed from the start. Desperate to take the fort before Dragut died, Mustafa ordered the final assault on June 23rd. This wasn't a battle, it was an execution. The night before, the defenders inside St. Elmo knew the end had come. No more boats, no more supplies. Jean de Valette sent his final message. You are the keys to our survival. Hold them as long as you have breath. And what happened next became one of the most haunting scenes in military history. The surviving knights gathered in the tiny chapel. They confessed sins to one another. They embraced. And then, the wounded made a request. Men without legs, men burned by wildfire, men too weak to stand. They asked to be carried to the breach. They asked to be strapped into chairs, sword in hand, facing the enemy. If they couldn't stand to fight, they would sit to die. Dawn broke on June 23rd, eve of the feast of St. John the Baptist. The Ottomans attacked with everything. Wave after wave of Janissaries surged over the rubble. The resistance was ferocious. For 4 hours, a handful of dying men held back an army of thousands. The knights in chairs swung swords until they were buried beneath bodies. Arquebusiers fired until their barrels melted. Even Ottoman chroniclers wrote of it with shuddering respect. But numbers are numbers. By midday, the last defender fell. Fort St. Elmo had finally fallen. It had cost the Ottoman Empire 30 days, 8,000 casualties, and tons of gunpowder. To capture a ruin defended by a few hundred men. And when Mustafa Pasha stepped into the silent, body-strewn courtyard, he looked across the harbor at the towering walls of St. Angelo and whispered, Allah, if so small a son has cost us so dear, what price shall we have to pay for the Father? But admiration didn't last. Rage did, and he ordered revenge. Mustafa Pasha didn't just want victory, he wanted humiliation. He looked at the bodies of the knights who'd bled him for a month, and he snapped. He ordered their corpses stripped, their chests cut open in the shape of a cross. Then he had them decapitated. Their mutilated bodies were nailed to wooden planks and thrown into the harbor like garbage, so the tide would carry them straight across to St. Angelo. One final message to Jean de Valette. And on that same day, Dragut Reyes finally died. He died moments after hearing St. Elmo had been taken. He died thinking the Ottomans had won, never realizing St. Elmo was a Pyrrhic victory. Those 30 days had pushed the siege deep into the most lethal part of summer. Across the water, Jean de Valette watched the headless bodies of his brothers bobbing in the waves. The grief inside the citadel was crushing. But Valette didn't have time to grieve. He saw Mustafa's message and drafted his reply. He walked down into the dungeons, no screaming, no speeches, just one cold instruction. Bring me the Ottoman prisoners. And within hours, the diplomacy of blood began. Ottoman prisoners were dragged up to the ramparts of St. Angelo. There was no trial, no mercy. In full view of the Ottoman army across the harbor, executioners swung their axes, heads rolled onto limestone. But Valette wasn't finished. He ordered the severed heads stuffed into cannons. The gunners lit the matches, and with a sickening thud, the cannons fired. A rain of human remains fell into the Ottoman lines. The message was unmistakable. You wanted a war of terror. Now you have one. Mustafa Pasha was furious. He had taken St. Elmo, but he had lost something more important. The psychological war. He'd hoped to break the defenders' spirit. Instead, he'd turned them into cornered wolves. Valette issued a decree: take no prisoners. From this point on, every man on Malta knew surrender was just a slower death. With St. Elmo gone, the Ottoman fleet could finally enter the harbor. Piali Pasha sailed his galleys into Marsamxet. Now the full weight of the Ottoman war machine turned toward the last Christian strongholds, Sanglea and Birgu. Two fortified fingers of land reaching into the harbor like a defiant peace sign, connected by a narrow bridge of boats. Inside, civilians, knights, militia, and the Grandmaster himself. Mustafa moved his basilisks to the high ground and began a bombardment so constant it made modern artillery seem polite. Some days, history records, there wasn't a single moment of silence from sunrise to sunset. Limestone dust became so thick, men coughed up white sludge. Civilians, women, children lived in cellars and tunnels. They emerged only to carry water, repair walls, or drag the dying away. And then, in the thick of this despair, something impossible happened. For weeks, a small relief force had been waiting in Sicily, paralyzed by indecision and bad weather. Only about 600 men, 42 knights, led by a Spanish commander, Don Melchior de Robles. They slipped past the Ottoman blockade under cover of darkness, landing on the remote north coast, then marched across the island in silence, dodging patrols. If they were caught, they'd be slaughtered instantly. But under a thick sea mist, they ghosted through enemy lines. And one morning, the defenders looked down from the walls of Birgu and saw something they hadn't seen in months: the flag of St. George. The gates opened. The Piccolo Soccorso, the little relief, marched in. Bells rang. People sobbed. 600 men wasn't an army. Against 40,000 Ottomans, it was a drop of water in a wildfire. But psychologically, it was an earthquake. It told the defenders, "You are not forgotten." Mustafa Pasha was stunned. How could an enemy force simply walk into a besieged city under his nose? Humiliation burned, and he realized time was slipping away. It was July. Heat was turning lethal. Disease, dysentery, typhoid began stalking the Ottoman camp. Water was bad. Food was rotting. Mustafa knew he couldn't wait for starvation. He needed a knockout blow. So he looked at Sanglea. Its seawalls were low. If he could strike from land and sea at the same time, he could crush it. But Ottoman ships couldn't sail into the inner harbor. The guns of St. Angelo covered the entrance. So Mustafa did something insane, something almost unbelievable. He ordered 80 heavy boats dragged overland. Men greased the rocks, laid logs, and physically hauled ships across Mount Sipahis, dropping them into the water behind Christian defenses, a feat of engineering that could rival the pyramids. Suddenly, Sanglea looked out and saw an Ottoman fleet where no fleet should exist. Mustafa prepared the double strike. Janissaries would assault the land walls. Amphibious troops would strike from the sea. And leading this sea attack were the Yalas, fanatics who smoked hashish before battle, wore no armor, and fought with suicidal frenzy. July 15th, the Battle of the Waters. At dawn, over 3,000 elite Ottoman troops surged toward Sanglea's sea walls, chanting prayers, swords drawn. At the same time, a massive land assault hit from the north. Sanglea was caught in a vice, but Valette wasn't caught off guard. Weeks earlier, Maltese divers had driven massive wooden stakes into the seabed, chained together with iron hoops, an underwater palisade hidden just beneath the surface. The Ottoman boats slammed into it, splintered, stopped cold, stuck 50 yards offshore. Perfect targets for arquebusiers on the walls. Candelessa, the corsair commander, ordered his men into the water. Thousands jumped in. And then the knights did something unthinkable. They didn't hide behind walls. They opened the sally ports and charged into the sea. Imagine the chaos. Men grappling waist-deep in water, silk robes soaked and dragging, steel armor pulling men down like anchors. The harbor turned opaque with blood, and the Maltese militia, born in this water, became decisive. They swam like sharks, slipping behind Ottoman soldiers, pulling them under, cutting throats, drowning them. This wasn't a battle of formations. It was a drowning contest. But the true trap came next. A second wave of Ottoman reserve boats spotted what looked like a weak point near the base of St. Angelo. They steered toward it, cheering, thinking they'd found the back door to victory. They didn't realize they were sailing straight into the crosshairs of the greatest ambush of the siege. Hidden behind a low wall, camouflaged at the waterline, was a battery of 5 heavy cannons, commanded by Chevalier de Girolles. He ordered his gunners to wait. Hold fire. Let them come close. 200 yards, 150, close enough to see the whites of their eyes. Then, he dropped his hand. All 5 cannons fired, loaded with grape shot, iron nails, chains, musket balls. It was like a giant shotgun blast at point-blank range. 9 of the 10 boats were instantly shattered. Hundreds of men were shredded before they even understood what happened. The reserve force didn't retreat. It simply ceased to exist. Seeing their reinforcements vaporized, Ottoman morale collapsed. The defenders pushed forward, driving survivors back into the sea. By noon, the water was so choked with corpses, it was said you could walk on the dead without wetting your feet. Ottoman losses, nearly 4,000 in a single morning. Knights, barely 200. Mustafa watched from the hill, furious and stunned. His best surprise attack had been turned into a slaughterhouse by wooden stakes and hidden cannons. The defenders celebrated, believing maybe, just maybe, the Ottomans would leave. They were wrong. Mustafa didn't quit. He got even. He stopped trying to be clever and began erasing the forts inch by inch. August became a weapon. Heat radiated from white limestone like an oven. Wells turned brackish. Men drank vinegar mixed with filthy water. Bodies rotted in ditches, baking in the sun. Mustafa unleashed the basilisks on a 24-hour rotation, but the deadliest threat came from below. Ottoman sappers tunneled under the walls, planting mines to blow defenses apart. The knights dug countermine tunnels, underground knife fights in total darkness, men suffocating in narrow holes beneath the earth. And then, on August 18th, the world ended. A massive explosion ripped through the bastion of Castile. A section of wall vanished in dust and smoke. Before the dust settled, Janissaries poured in. The defenders wavered. Panic spread. Retreat began. And then, Jean de Valette appeared. He wasn't in the citadel. He wasn't issuing orders from safety. He grabbed a helmet and a pike and ran straight into the breach. A 71-year-old man, limping from old wounds, charging into the heart of the collapse. Commanders screamed for him to retreat. He ignored them. He fought, hand to hand. And seeing their Grandmaster fighting in the breach, shame replaced fear. The retreat became a countercharge. Knights and civilians, women carrying stones, children carrying water, rushed the breach. Valette was wounded, but refused to leave. He pointed his sword toward Ottoman banners planted on the rubble and shouted, "I will not withdraw so long as those banners wave in the wind." Hours of slaughter followed, and finally, the Ottomans fell back. The breach was held, barely. That night, Valette refused safety. He ordered his bed moved to the breach. He slept on the rocks under open sky, where the enemy would strike next. Because his presence was the glue holding crumbling walls and crumbling morale together. Mustafa Pasha, desperate, unleashed one final horror. He ordered corpses cut open and thrown into the harbor's water source. Biological warfare. And as both sides crawled toward the end, a whisper spread through the Ottoman camp. Soldiers looked nervously north. Winter was coming, and with it, something else. September storms rolled in. The wind shifted. Piali wanted to leave. Mustafa hesitated. And then, on the morning of September 7th, the horizon finally broke. Not Ottoman sails, but Spanish. The Gran Soccorso, the Great Relief, 28 galleys, 8,000 men, Spanish tercios, the most feared infantry in Europe. Fresh, disciplined, angry. They landed at St. Paul's Bay, and when the Ottomans saw them, the last thread of morale snapped. Mustafa ordered retreat. The siege was over. For 24 hours, the Ottoman army scrambled to escape, abandoning guns, tents, even their sick. Inside Birgu and Senglea, defenders were too weak to chase. They simply watched and wept as the nightmare ended. But the siege had one last bloody act. Mustafa learned the truth. The relief force wasn't 20,000. It was only 8,000. He still had 15,000 fighting men. And if he returned to Constantinople having fled from a smaller force, the Sultan might execute him. So pride flared. He stopped the evacuation, ordered his exhausted troops back inland, and sealed their fate. The two armies met near Nakshar. The Spanish charge wasn't a maneuver. It was a riot of vengeance. Ottoman lines shattered. Janissaries, invincible for a century, broke and ran. The retreat turned into a rout. The Spanish chased them back to the bay. Ottoman soldiers threw themselves into the sea, trying to swim to galleys. The water turned red again. September 11th, the last Ottoman galley rowed away. Silence returned to Malta. The heat broke. The rains came, washing blood from rock. Valette didn't celebrate. He walked through ruins. Out of 8,000 defenders, only 600 could still hold a weapon. The island was a graveyard, but in devastation, Valette made a decision that shaped the Mediterranean. He pointed to Mount Sipahis, the ridge where Ottoman cannons had stood, and said, "We will build a new city there. A fortress city, built by gentlemen for gentlemen." On March 28, 1566, he laid the foundation stone. They leveled the ridge, built grid streets to channel sea breeze, raised walls so thick they still dominate today. He named it after himself, Valletta, Humilissima Civitas Vallettae, the most humble city of Valletta. It was anything but humble. It was a statement carved into limestone. We are still here. Jean de Valette died in 1568 before the city was finished. But his tomb inscription didn't list titles or lineage. It simply said, "Here lies Valette, the shield of Europe." And that's why the Great Siege matters. Not because it was clean, not because it was noble, but because it proved something terrifying and inspiring. Numbers don't win wars by themselves. Technology matters, geography matters, leadership matters. But the most dangerous weapon is the human will to refuse surrender. So the next time you feel overwhelmed, when the odds are stacked and the math tells you to quit, remember St. Elmo. Remember swimmers fighting in Red Harbor water. Remember the old man running into the breach with a pike. History isn't written by the biggest armies. It's written by those who refuse to leave the field. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most brutal sieges, make sure you're subscribed. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next chapter. And I've got one final question for you. Do you think the Knights would have won if Dragut Reyes hadn't been killed? Or was Ottoman defeat inevitable because of logistics and overreach? Drop your thoughts below. I'll be down there debating with you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter of history.